Hello. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about women as pioneers in still life. Due to societal limitations and restricted access to resources, women often face challenges working in traditional artistic genres like historical paintings or those that involve the nude. As noted by art critics, including Linda Nochlin in her 1971 article, the still life genre was often seen as lesser, and critics like Willem Guerre have, even incondescendingly might I add, suggested that fruits and flowers were especially suited for women. As we reconsider what constitutes great art, we can create space to recognize these works for their true value. The paintings shown here, and I've just pulled An Abundance of Still Lives by artists Claire Peters, Rachel Royce, Norsula Katia. These are just a few examples from a much longer list of works, productions by women in the still life genre. Today, we're going to narrow our focus in on Italian still life artists, Fede Galizia and Giovanna Garzoni, and we'll touch on their training, their stylistic choices, and how these shaped their distinct, innovative approaches to still life. Hopefully, in doing so, we can understand their contributions to the genre as true pioneers. Starting off with Fede Galizia, which unfortunately I couldn't find any actual portraits of her, so this is just her depiction of Judith. A little background. Like many virtuous women artists, Galizia grew up exposed to art. Her father, Nunzio Galizia, who is believed to be in the portrait that she did in the left, he was a miniaturist and illuminator. Early on, he recognized her aptitude for art and began training her. After her tutelage in Lombardy, she began her career as a portraitist, and she was also occasionally cited as an illuminist, although there have been no works in this realm able to be tied to her. One of her earliest and most notable patrons, Jesuit Paolo Marugia, who she actually did a portrait of on the right, wrote of her impressive techniques, saying that she notably portrayed from life her father and her mother in a way that no one could wish for more. This commitment to realist portrayal that we now see in Glietti's portraits is something that will reemerge when we examine her still lives. Now we can move on to talking about her artistic style in terms of these still lives. There were three key features of her technique. The first was her distinct composition. The second, her inclusion of ephemeral details, and also her naturalistic portrayal. This painting really showcases Fede Glietti's signature compositional style. At the center, you'll often find a main element, like a basket or a dish, placed on a shallow edge. Around it, smaller objects, like nuts or fruits, are usually casually arranged, and at the side or near the edge of the platform. And this kind of arrangement is considered typical of the Lombardy school. And while you'll also see this in many Italian still life paintings from the 16th and 17th century, it's important to note that Galizia is highly credited for establishing this style for the Lombardy school. The intimate scale and the use of panel backing in most of her work is considered to reflect the influence of Northern European art on her painting. And there's also a certain kind of robust compactness to the way she arranges her subjects. So here, the peaches and the pears really feel very grounded and solid in the composition. What's also interesting about Glietti's still life is how it reflects a sense of development. The peaches and pears, for instance, are lit in that kind of pretentious way that gives them a sense of perfection, like they're at their peak of liveliness. But then, if you look to the cut pear, you see it's starting to brown, introducing an element of ephemerality. In this way, Galizzia's work brings a more natural and tangible sense of vanitas, where she captures the fleeting nature of life in a very relatable and almost palpable way. And I mentioned the idea of a pretentious quality because many of Glietti's male counterparts painted still lives in just that way. Where Glietti's paintings lean more towards a realistic rendition, the works of many male artists like Caravaggio or Figino, which I've pulled one of Figino's still lives here to the right, they had a much more grandiose and sublimated effect. With Figino's peaches, there's not a singular sign of aging. Critics have noted that in Glietti's later years of production, her brushstrokes became much freer, and the atmosphere of the entire composition was much more apparent. And these photos aren't the best quality, but we can still see what they're referring to. If we take a closer look at the still life on the left, we can clearly see Glietti's brushstrokes, where they were much less visible in her earlier Peaches in a Bowl. Both paintings also have a greater proportion of foreground that softens the harsh, exaggerated relief from the black background we saw also in the earlier still life. In fact, the painting on the right's background is only slightly darker than the color of the table. This change really adds to the realism, the brushstrokes make it more dynamic, and it increases the liveliness of the still lives. Now let's take a look at Giovanni Garzoni, who was working in a slightly later timeline than Galizia, but was also an Italian still life painter and pioneer. A little background, Garzoni's parents were Venetian, and some historians speculate they came from a long line of Venetian painters. Garzoni herself was born in Ascoli in central Italy, but for all extensive purposes, her work falls clearly into the category of a Florentine artist. After living there for a substantial time, she was highly prized by Florentine nobles and the Grand Duke, and many historians suggest that she even studied there, and this is given the apparent high influence of Jacopo Ligazzi on her work. Ligazzi painted hundreds of illustrations of botanicals and zoological specimens, a couple of which I've pulled and placed on the right here. And we can clearly see the parallels between Garzoni and Ligazzi's works, looking at their attention to detail and also their coloring and the drawing. And we'll definitely see this come up later, as many of Garzoni's works definitely have that same kind of scientific illustration quality. Garzoni also had other teachers and mentors in flora and fauna. In 1616, she learned to paint herbarium from the chemist Giovanni Vorvino, and her expertise, again, in painting botanicals like those that I've pulled here, no doubt had a huge influence on how she developed her particular approach to still life painting. Briefly, before we talk more about those still lives, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge her vast capabilities. Like Galizia, Garzoni was incredibly versatile, and her portfolio consisted of a wide variety of art. This portrait of a dog is, in my opinion, just simply fantastic. And now to talk a little bit about her artistic style. There are three key features of Garzoni's paintings, and I'd argue that these key features are ways that you could walk into any museum and immediately identify her still lives on the spot. The first is her distinctive stippling technique, also her overinflation of scale, and this one in particular is more in terms of her fruit still lives than, say, her flowers and vases. And then the third is her, of course, impressive naturalistic detailing. Many of Garzoni's still lives were tempera on vellum. As seen with her figs here, the stippling technique really adds an interesting dimensionality to the painting that goes beyond shadow and perspective. And the use of vellum also adds a distinctive coloring. These can be seen in almost all of her still lives. The figs have cracks and fissures, and the leaves wilt and brown in a way that reveals an unconventional beauty, and the balance between life and decay. Kind of like how Galizia also showed that same ephemerality in her paintings. Again, here we can see nature's imperfections, the distorted shape of the lemons, the slight wilting and browning of the leaves. Again, these all introduce that same ephemeral quality. Garzoni's standard composition is, much like Galizia's, reflective of a central Lombardy style, and in fact, Garzoni was likely aware of Galizia's style and to some extent influenced by it. And I just thought this quote by the French naturalism writers, the Goncourt brothers, was perfect at demonstrating just how talented Garzoni was at depicting real life. Garzoni also created several still lives of flowers in a vase, and as we can see here, Garzoni actually occasionally abandoned that stippling technique for certain areas of the painting, but in exchange we get this unbelievable translucency and refraction of light on the vase, and it really gives the illusion of real glass. So Garzoni and Galizia are both pioneers of still life in their own right, and they both have very different approaches. Now we're going to briefly compare their two works, not to assign value, but to highlight their own individual creativity and unique innovations. To do this, I chose two paintings on the same subject matter so we could easily identify these distinctions. On the right, we have Garzoni's cherries, and on the left, Galizia's. Side by side, their images are the antithesis of light and dark. Galizia's dramatic use of light and total relief give her cherries the effect of liminality. We have no precise sense of space or setting. Garzoni's almost blown out use of light is more reminiscent of an inspection on a scientific specimen. Her stippling technique lend the cherries a two-dimensional quality in comparison to Galizia's. So Galizia and Garzoni, through their distinct techniques and style, offer so much to admire, not just as women artists of their time, but as exceptional talents who push the boundaries of still life. It's important that we recognize and reestablish their place in art history, acknowledging their mastery and elevating their legacies alongside their male counterparts. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope this discussion sparks a renewed appreciation for both their works and encourages you to look into more women still life artists.